Welcome to Research Notes by Lucas Engelhardt. In this series, I provide brief comments on research that I've read recently. I make no promises to get everything right and certainly leave a lot out. My hope is that this series will spark your interest so that you look some of these papers up. Today, we'll look at a paper by Dube and Lindner from the winter 2021 issue of the Journal of Economic Perspectives. The paper's title, City Limits: What Do Local Area Minimum Wages Do? This paper is divided into three main parts: basic facts, arguments concerning city-level minimum wages, and the evidence. For the sake of time, I will devote most of this presentation to the evidence. First, just a few basic facts. In the US, there are 42 cities that have city-level minimum wages. 24 of these, so more than half, are in the San Francisco Bay Area. The cities with city-level minimum wages don't really reflect the US as a whole. Rather, these cities tend to have higher than average wages and costs of living, and also a much larger share of the population being Democrats, generally around 75%. The big question for city-level minimum wages is how much the porous nature of city limits has an impact on the effects of the minimum wage. For many businesses, moving from the US to Mexico or Canada to avoid the US minimum wage isn't particularly feasible. But moving from inside Chicago to just outside of it to avoid the minimum wage is much more doable. One would expect, then, that city-level minimum wages would have much larger local effects, especially on employment, than we see at the national level. So on to the evidence. The method in this paper uses regression to compare those cities with minimum wage to cities without them, but control for a number of other factors. The idea is that we want to capture the effects of the minimum wage, not the effects of having 75% of your city being Democrats. In brief, the evidence lines up with a lot of what the recent minimum wage research has shown. City-level minimum wages do increase wages and seem to have very little impact on employment. The loss of jobs that paid less than the new minimum wage was offset by increases in the number of jobs that pay the new minimum wage or slightly more. However, the controls here matter quite a bit. Without them, you end up with a goofy result that suggests that the loss in jobs that paid below the new minimum wage is offset by jobs paying $50 an hour or more. Obviously, this isn't the case. Rather, the kinds of cities where minimum wages are being introduced also happen to be attracting some very high-paying jobs as well. In addition to the original work for this paper, the paper cites a number of studies looking for other effects from city-level minimum wages. Two effects that people find. First, an increase in prices, which seems to stop right at the city limit. This is interesting because it suggests that consumers aren't in fact willing to drive to the suburbs to avoid the higher prices, so price competition between suburbs and the city isn't very strong. Second, reduced turnover. This helps offset some of the costs for employers since they can save on training, and may explain some of why we don't see significant losses in employment. One effect for which there is no evidence is cutting health benefits to make up for wages. One last effect worth mentioning, as it calls into question a major premise of minimum wage increases. There was one study that used administrative data from Seattle to show that the minimum wage there did lead to significant decreases in hours. However, survey evidence suggests workers are working just as much as before. Dube and Lindner suggests this might be because employers have started underreporting hours, which means that the effect of wage increase is much smaller than one might think. Some final thoughts. This paper aligns with what I've read recently about the minimum wage, so very little was surprising about it. Probably the most surprising thing was the possibility of hour underreporting. This would imply that people are effectively working unpaid hours to make up for the fact that they're being paid more during their paid hours. I really wonder how much our data might be affected by this kind of phenomenon. If it's a lot, then this could call into question how effective the minimum wage can be at increasing weekly take-home pay. Generally, economists assume that enforcement of a minimum wage is effectively costless. After all, employees would want to report being underpaid, right? But if this is happening, it suggests that enforcement may be worth thinking about more explicitly.